On the morning of March 24th, 1919, a train carrying the last emperor of Austria approached the Swiss frontier. Karl of Habsburg had left his palace, his capital, and the state his family had ruled for centuries. He still wore a field marshal's uniform. Before crossing the border, he issued a declaration rejecting the new republic's authority over his dynasty. Within days, Austria answered with a law that expelled the Habsburgs and transferred major family assets to the state. This was not the Romanovs' ending. There was no cellar execution and no single night of annihilation. The punishment was slower: exile, confiscation, statelessness, political irrelevance, and the breakup of a family across Europe and North America. Yet the dynasty did not vanish. One former emperor tried twice to recover a throne and died on a distant island. One archduke reinvented himself as a Ukrainian patriot and died in a Soviet prison. The last crown prince eventually returned, not as emperor, but as an elected European politician. So what actually happened to Austria's royal family after their empire disappeared? Their former world. To understand the scale of the fall, it is necessary to understand what the House of Habsburg-Lorraine had been in 1918. The family was not simply the monarchy of modern Austria. Its ruler was Emperor of Austria and Apostolic King of Hungary, while the dynasty's titles, residences, military commands, family funds, court offices, and ceremonial authority stretched across a multinational state, from the Alps to Galicia, and from Bohemia to the Adriatic. By the last pre-war census, Austria-Hungary contained roughly 51 million people. It was not a centralized nation-state, but a dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary had separate governments and parliaments, while foreign affairs, the common armed forces, and their finances were handled jointly under the emperor-king. The dynasty stood above that structure. The common army swore loyalty to the monarch. Senior archdukes occupied military commands, court positions, and governorships. Schönbrunn and the Hofburg were not merely homes, they were working centers of authority. The family controlled a confusing mixture of personal property, common dynastic funds, entailed estates, and possessions administered through the imperial court. That distinction became critical after 1918 because the Republic did not legally treat every estate, painting, and bank account in the same way. The ruling house was also an institution of succession. Male archdukes were raised for military, administrative, diplomatic, or ecclesiastical roles. Marriages linked Vienna to other Catholic dynasties. Children received titles from birth and entered a hierarchy governed by house rules. Even relatives far from the throne benefited from the assumption that Habsburg blood carried public meaning. Their private lives were never entirely private because the family existed to reproduce the ruling line. The Habsburgs' position depended on more than force. Dynastic ritual gave continuity to territories whose peoples spoke many languages and held competing national loyalties. Franz Joseph, who reigned from 1848 to 1916, became the human embodiment of permanence. Karl inherited that prestige, but not the stability that had sustained it. By then, the dynasty's privileges were inseparable from an empire exhausted by war. The family was neither uniformly wealthy nor politically united. Some branches possessed large estates, others depended on court allowances or military salaries, but all were protected by the same system of rank and dynastic legitimacy. Once it vanished, those differences became decisive. Members with private assets or useful professions had options. Those dependent on imperial office faced a sharper fall. When the monarchy broke apart, the Habsburgs did not merely lose a throne. They lost the system that defined their names, legal status, income, and purpose. A family trained from birth to govern suddenly faced a question court education had never prepared it to answer. How does a dynasty survive when dynasty itself becomes illegal? Road to destruction. The answer began with the First World War. Austria-Hungary entered the conflict in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but 4 years of mobilization exposed every weakness in the monarchy. Military casualties were enormous. Food shortages became severe. Inflation eroded salaries and savings. National conflicts long managed through bargaining, patronage, and imperial authority were sharpened by hunger, censorship, military rule, and mass death. Karl became emperor in November 1916 after Franz Joseph's death. He inherited a war he had not started, an alliance increasingly dominated by Germany, and governments with diminishing room to maneuver. He pursued peace contacts through his wife Zita's brothers, the Bourbon-Parma princes Sixtus and Xavier, but the secret effort failed and later produced the damaging Sixtus affair. By 1918, Karl's credibility with Germany was weakened, while the Allies had moved closer to supporting the independence of the empire's nationalities rather than reform within a Habsburg framework. American diplomacy's recognition of Czechoslovak and South Slav claims further reduced the value of late imperial concessions. The military situation then collapsed. Bulgaria left the war in September 1918. Allied forces advanced in the Balkans. Italy attacked at Vittorio Veneto. Inside the monarchy, national councils increasingly acted as governments before legal authority had formally passed to them. Czechoslovak independence was proclaimed in Prague. South Slav leaders severed ties with Vienna and Budapest. Hungary ended the political union with Austria. Karl's attempt on October 16 to federalize the Austrian half of the monarchy came after the decisive political momentum had already moved beyond him. This produced a problem no Habsburg constitution could solve. Karl could negotiate with ministers, but ministers no longer controlled all the territories they claimed to represent. He could issue orders to an imperial army, but units were disintegrating, and soldiers were trying to reach home. He could offer autonomy, but national movements now expected sovereignty and allied recognition. The dynasty's traditional method, preserving unity by conceding just enough difference, had run out of time. The issue was no longer how the empire would be reorganized, but who would inherit its territory, institutions, soldiers, debts, and diplomatic recognition. After the armistice at Villa Giusti, politicians representing German-speaking provinces created German Austria. They disagreed over social policy and union with Germany, but broadly agreed that hereditary monarchy had ended. Karl was not driven from Vienna by an attacking mob. Advisors instead negotiated the wording of his withdrawal. On November 11th, he accepted the people's decision concerning the form of the state and relinquished every participation in government. He avoided the word abdication. That omission mattered. To Republican leaders, the monarchy was finished regardless of Karl's private interpretation. To Karl, the declaration suspended his exercise of power without extinguishing his rights. The next day, German Austria proclaimed itself a republic. On November 13th, Karl issued a parallel statement concerning Hungary. The empire had ceased to function, but the former monarch still believed lawful restoration possible. Karl, Zita, and their children moved from Schönbrunn to Eckartsau, a Habsburg estate east of Vienna. The government faced three choices: secure a formal abdication, intern him, or remove him. Concern about the murdered Russian imperial family encouraged British involvement, and Lieutenant Colonel Edward Lyle Strutt helped arrange departure under British protection. Yet departure did not settle the conflict. As Karl's train neared Switzerland, he issued the Feldkirch Manifesto, declaring acts of the new Austrian Assembly affecting his rights invalid. Exile was no longer merely a retreat. The former emperor had confirmed that he remained a claimant. The Republic now moved against the entire house. The fall. On April 3, 1919, Austria's Constituent National Assembly passed two laws that destroyed the dynasty's public position. One abolished nobility and the legal use of noble titles. The other, commonly called the Habsburg Law, banished members of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine unless they renounced membership in the ruling house, abandoned dynastic claims, and declared themselves loyal citizens of the Republic. Karl himself was excluded without that option because he had openly maintained his sovereign rights. The law also addressed property, but not through a simple seizure of everything bearing the Habsburg name. Assets administered as court property and the common, entailed funds of the ruling house, were transferred to the Republic. The stated public purpose included assistance for victims of the war. Personal private property remained legally distinct. That distinction generated disputes for decades, because imperial administration had deliberately blurred the line between the monarch's household, the dynasty's commonwealth, and the state. For Karl and Zita, the immediate result was permanent exile from Austria. For the wider family, the law imposed a choice that was almost existential. A Habsburg could preserve dynastic allegiance and remain abroad, or sign away political claims and attempt to return as a private citizen. The Republic was not merely removing a former ruler. It was breaking the legal mechanism by which an extended family had functioned as a public institution. The speed of the transformation was remarkable. In late October 1918, Karl still issued imperial decrees. By November, his state had fragmented. By April 1919, the family name itself triggered constitutional restrictions. Court appointments disappeared, oaths to the emperor were cancelled, military uniforms no longer conferred authority. The new Austria was a small, economically distressed republic centered on Vienna, while many Habsburg estates, residences, and former subjects now lay in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Italy, or the South Slav kingdom. There was no single successor government with which the family could negotiate its future. The family's losses therefore varied by place. Austria used the Habsburg law. Czechoslovakia abolished noble titles and pursued land reform and state claims against former dynastic property. Hungary remained legally a kingdom, but without a king, preserving the crown of St. Stephen while refusing to restore the crowned monarch. In other regions, individual archdukes retained some personal property, lost estates through land reform, or depended on foreign relatives and private income. The political body called the Imperial House had been dismantled, but its members entered the post-war world under different laws. Publicly, the Austrian Republic presented these measures as democratic self-defense and social redress after a catastrophic war. The dynasty had embodied the old state. Its commonwealth could be redirected toward the casualties that state had produced. Yet the government did not prosecute Karl for war crimes or attempt to execute the family. The Austrian break with monarchy was severe but legalistic. Unlike several defeated dynasties elsewhere, the Habsburgs were neither imprisoned as a family nor physically purged. They were converted from sovereigns into a constitutional problem. That problem soon returned in its most dangerous form. Karl believed that Austria was closed to him, but Hungary was different. He had been crowned there in 1916, and his 1918 declaration had not used the language of abdication. Hungary's post-war revolutions had ended, Admiral Miklos Horthy served as regent, and the country still called itself a kingdom. The empty throne appeared to offer a route back, but the survivors of the dynasty were about to discover that even monarchists could prefer a monarchy without the monarch. Immediate aftermath. Exile first looked less like imprisonment than suspended court life. In Switzerland, Karl and Zita lived with their children and a reduced household, supported by what private resources remained and by loyal sympathizers. They continued to use imperial forms within the family. Karl received visitors, followed events in Austria and Hungary, and refused to treat the republics as the final settlement. But every practical fact contradicted the old ceremony. He had no treasury, no army, no recognized government, and no secure territorial base. The wider family faced the same collapse at different levels. Archdukes who had commanded armies lost their commissions. Court officials and servants had to find new employers. Dependents who had once received salaries or pensions from dynastic institutions discovered that those funds were under state control or trapped in litigation. Residences were converted to public use, government offices, museums, schools, or military facilities. Family members could not assume that a title recognized in one successor state had any legal meaning in another. In Republican Austria, even the aristocratic von disappeared from legal names. The wives and children of the former ruling line bore the consequences without having made the political decisions. Zita was 26 when the empire fell and had 7 children by early 1919. An 8th would be born after Karl's death. Crown Prince Otto, 6 years old in 1918, went from heir to a multinational monarchy to a child legally excluded from his birthplace unless one day he renounced the claim that defined his upbringing. Education became a political task. Zita raised the children as Catholics and as members of a reigning house in exile, while also preparing them for careers in a world that might never restore them. Austria's policy was uncompromising, but the public response was not uniform. Social Democrats viewed the dynasty's removal and the transfer of family funds as necessary parts of Republican equality. Christian social politicians were more divided. Some accepted the Republic pragmatically, while Catholic and legitimist circles retained loyalty to Karl. Most Austrians, however, were dealing with food shortages, unemployment, demobilization, and the question of whether their truncated state could survive. The former imperial family remained symbolically powerful, but the immediate emergency of daily life was larger than the fate of one household. Karl then converted the legal ambiguity surrounding Hungary into action. In March 1921, he traveled secretly from Switzerland to Hungary and met Horthy, expecting the regent to return authority to his crowned king. Horthy refused. His reasons were practical as well as personal. The victorious allies opposed a Habsburg restoration, and Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes feared that Karl's return could revive Hungarian territorial claims or the old empire. Their emerging little entente made clear that restoration might lead to war. Karl withdrew, but he did not abandon the attempt. In October 1921, he returned with Zita by aircraft, gathered legitimist officers and troops in western Hungary, and moved toward Budapest. This time the dispute became armed. Government forces and pro-Horthy volunteers stopped the royalists near Budaörs. The clash was limited compared with the war Europe had just survived, but it ended the realistic possibility of a Habsburg restoration. Karl and Zita were arrested and held at Tihany Abbey. Under Allied pressure, Hungary's parliament formally dethroned the Habsburg dynasty in November, even while preserving the kingdom as a form of state. The former emperor and empress were then placed aboard a British vessel and sent to Madeira, a Portuguese Atlantic island, chosen because it was remote from Central European politics. Their children joined them. They lived first near Funchal and later at Quinta do Monte, with increasingly strained finances. In early 1922, Karl contracted a respiratory illness that developed into pneumonia. He died on April 1st, not yet 35, and was buried in the Church of Our Lady of Monte. He had lost the empire in 1918, Austria in 1919, Hungary in 1921, and his life in 1922. His death changed the nature of the Habsburg question. The claimant was now 9-year-old Otto. No adult emperor remained to launch another restoration. Zita became the guardian of 8 children and the keeper of a political inheritance that no state recognized. The dynasty had survived biologically, but its center had become a widowed mother, an underage heir, and a portable archive of memory. For the survivors, exile was no longer a temporary pause before return. It was the condition in which they would build their lives. The survivors' different paths. The Habsburg survivors did not follow one route. The family was too scattered and politically divided for a single fate. Some continued to think as dynasts. Some accepted republican life. Some attached themselves to new national causes. Others entered professions, armies, or parliaments that would have been almost unimaginable before 1918. The first path was Zita's: preserve the family as a court without a country. After Karl's death, King Alfonso the Sias helped the widow and her children leave Madeira for Spain. They settled at Laquidio on the Bay of Biscay. Money was limited, but Zita refused to treat her children as former royals. Otto was educated as head of the house and lawful heir in the family's understanding. The younger children were trained for modern careers. In 1929, they moved to Belgium, where Otto studied at the Catholic University of Leuven and earned a doctorate in social sciences. This upbringing produced a paradox. Zita maintained the discipline of monarchy, yet her children survived because they learned to operate outside it. Robert later worked in banking and represented Habsburg interests abroad. Felix pursued business. Karl Ludwig entered commercial life after military service. The daughters married into European royal or noble families, but marriage no longer automatically restored political influence. The household remained dynastic while becoming professional in practice. Otto followed a second path, turning inheritance into political activism. During the 1930s, he supported Austrian independence and opposed Nazi annexation. Some Austrian conservatives considered Habsburg restoration as one possible barrier to Hitler, but Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg did not restore the monarchy. In 1935, Austria's authoritarian government softened the Habsburg settlement, lifted parts of the ban, and began returning property to the family fund. That opening closed with the Anschluss in 1938. Nazi authorities again seized Habsburg property, targeted legitimists, and treated Otto as an enemy. When Germany invaded Belgium and France in 1940, the family fled through France, Spain, and Portugal. Zita and the younger children settled in Quebec. Otto operated mainly from the United States, where he argued for an independent post-war Austria and maintained contacts with American officials, including Franklin Roosevelt. Claims about the exact number of refugees he helped or his precise influence on Allied policy vary, but his anti-Nazi position is clear. His brothers Felix and Karl Ludwig volunteered for the United States Army. A family once identified with command of the Imperial Army now had sons wearing American uniforms against the regime that had absorbed Austria. The Second World War's end did not bring an uncomplicated homecoming. Austria restored its pre-1933 constitutional framework, including the Habsburg Law. The 1955 State Treaty committed Austria to maintain it. Otto therefore remained outside unless he made the required declaration. In 1961, he renounced claims to the throne and affirmed loyalty to the Republic, but the adequacy of his statement caused years of legal and political conflict. Austria's administrative court accepted it. Opponents still regarded his return as a threat to Republican principle. He finally entered Austria briefly in October 1966, after 48 years away. Demonstrations and a large protest strike showed that the dynasty's legal power was gone, but its symbolic power was not. Otto did not use the return to rebuild a royal movement. He lived chiefly in Bavaria, took German citizenship, and redirected his public identity toward European integration and anti-communism. From 1979 to 1999, he served in the European Parliament for Bavaria's Christian Social Union. The former Crown Prince became an elected politician. He championed Central and Eastern Europeans under communist rule and became associated with the Pan-European movement and the 1989 Pan-European Picnic. His career did not restore Habsburg sovereignty. It transformed dynastic internationalism into a modern argument for a united Europe. A third path appeared in Hungary, where the dynasty's position was more ambiguous. Archduke Joseph August, from the Hungarian Palatine branch, became head of state in August 1919 after the fall of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. He appointed a government, but the Allies would not recognize a Habsburg as Hungary's ruler, and he resigned within weeks. Unlike Karl, Joseph August adapted to the Horthy system. He served in Hungary's restored upper chamber and later became president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. His case showed that a Habsburg could retain standing and public roles if he stopped trying to reclaim supreme power. That compromise had limits. The country called itself a kingdom until 1946, but the throne remained empty. Horthy governed as regent, and the 1921 dethronement law blocked Karl's line. Legitimists continued to exist, yet neither Joseph August nor Otto could convert prestige into kingship. Monarchy survived as constitutional theater without a monarch, the reverse of the family's position in exile, where a dynasty survived without a state. A fourth path belonged to Archduke Wilhelm, an unusual 20th century Habsburg. During the war, he cultivated a Ukrainian identity, learned the language, commanded Ukrainian troops, and became known as Vasil Vyshyvanyi. After the empire's collapse, he supported Ukrainian independence and at times imagined a monarchical role. He was never crowned, and King of Ukraine remained a political fantasy. But his choice was significant. Instead of preserving the multinational empire, he attached his Habsburg identity to one of the national movements that had helped destroy it. After 1945, Wilhelm remained in Soviet-occupied Vienna and maintained contacts with Ukrainian activists and Western intelligence. In 1947, Soviet counterintelligence abducted him and took him to Kiev. He was interrogated, sentenced to imprisonment, and died in a prison hospital in August 1948. Karl had died because the dynasty could not recover its throne. Wilhelm died because the new age of ideological empires regarded his chosen national identity as a threat. Most Habsburgs had less dramatic endings. Cadet branches settled across Europe and the Americas. Some entered business, law, diplomacy, the church, academia, or the military. Their wealth varied greatly. The fall did not reduce every archduke to poverty, but it ended the automatic connection between birth and office. A Habsburg could inherit a name, family network, and private property. He or she could no longer inherit command over millions. Zita's long exile completed that transformation. She returned to Europe in the 1950s and lived in Switzerland, but for decades would not make Austria's required renunciation. In 1982, the government allowed her to visit after determining that, as a Habsburg by marriage, she did not need the same declaration. She entered not at the head of a restored court, but as an elderly widow, greeted by people for whom the empire had become memory. The family had survived by taking different paths, but none led back to the world of 1918. Transformation and legacy. Did the Habsburgs disappear? As a ruling institution? Yes. No successor state restored their common empire. Austria remained a republic. Hungary eventually abolished its crown without a king. The legal privileges of nobility vanished in Austria, and descendants who returned did so as citizens, not sovereigns. The imperial household, common ministries, dynastic army, and court hierarchy were gone beyond recovery. The property question outlived the political one. Austria's 1935 government began reversing parts of the settlement. Nazi rule seized the restored assets again. The post-war republic reinstated the earlier constitutional framework. Later restitution claims did not simply erase the 1919 transfer, because the legal chain involved Republican expropriation, authoritarian restoration, Nazi confiscation, and post-war treaty obligations. The result was an unusual survival. The Habsburg law remained part of Austria's constitutional history long after a practical restoration had ceased to be plausible. As a family and a cultural identity, however, the dynasty survived. Its members continued to marry, work, publish, campaign, and participate in public life. They maintained family archives, religious traditions, burial customs, and connections across the former imperial territories. Otto eventually transferred leadership of the house to his son Karl in 2007, but by then, head of the house was a private dynastic designation, not a state office. The family name retained international recognition precisely because it no longer carried legal authority. Austria's relationship with that memory changed repeatedly. The First Republic treated Habsburg restoration as a constitutional danger. The authoritarian Austrian state partially reversed confiscation in 1935. The Nazis seized the assets again and persecuted monarchist opponents. After 1945, the Second Republic restored the Habsburg law and made republican sovereignty part of its post-war identity. Yet later Austria also accepted the dynasty as heritage. Schönbrunn and the Hofburg became central historical sites. Imperial images entered tourism, film, exhibitions, and popular culture. The same state that excluded the family preserved and marketed the world that had made it famous. Funerals revealed that unresolved tension. When Zita died in Switzerland in 1989, she was buried in Vienna's imperial crypt after a major funeral at St. Stephen's Cathedral. Otto followed in 2011 after a public career in democratic Europe. These were not state restorations, but neither were they ordinary private burials. Rituals, titles, uniforms, and delegations from former Habsburg lands temporarily constructed the vanished monarchy as ceremony. The republic remained secure enough to permit imperial memory. Karl's reputation changed as well. Supporters emphasized his peace initiatives, personal faith, and refusal to prolong civil conflict in Hungary. Critics noted that he remained the ruler of a wartime empire, authorized military government, and never accepted the permanent legitimacy of the republics that replaced him. The Catholic Church beatified him in 2004. Beatification recognized religious virtue. It did not settle the political record of his reign. The distinction matters because commemoration can turn a complicated monarch into either a saintly peacemaker or a helpless victim, when the evidence supports a more difficult figure caught between reform, war, and dynastic conviction. Popular mythology also transformed Austria-Hungary itself. In nostalgic memory, the empire can appear as an elegant, tolerant Central Europe destroyed by nationalism. That image contains a partial truth. The monarchy connected regions, economies, institutions, and cultures, later divided by borders. But it can conceal political inequality, national conflict, wartime repression, and the limited democratic legitimacy of dynastic rule. The Habsburgs did not lose a perfectly harmonious civilization. They lost a state whose capacity to manage its contradictions had collapsed under total war. The dynasty's most durable adaptation was therefore not restoration, but reinterpretation. Zita preserved the family. Otto converted a supranational inheritance into European politics. Other branches became Hungarian public figures, American soldiers, businessmen, scholars, or national activists. The old titles became historical references, and the old palaces became public institutions. What survived was not imperial power. It was a portable identity, Catholic, Central European, multilingual, aristocratic, and adaptable enough to exist without a throne. Conclusion. What happened to Austria's royal family after the Habsburg Empire fell? They were not exterminated, and they did not simply fade into comfortable retirement. Austria expelled the ruling house, dismantled its legal privileges, and transferred major dynastic assets to the Republic. Karl tried to reverse the settlement, failed twice in Hungary, and died in exile. Zita raised 8 children across several countries. Otto spent nearly half a century barred from Austria before returning as a private citizen and building a career in democratic European politics. Other Habsburgs served new states, fought in foreign armies, embraced national causes, or disappeared into ordinary professional life. The central fact is that the family survived by surrendering the function that had defined it. Those who treated restoration as imminent remained trapped by 1918. Those who translated inheritance into religion, profession, national service, or European cooperation found a place in the new century. The empire ended quickly. The dynasty's adjustment took generations. Which fallen ruling house should After the Sword follow next? And do you think Otto's political career represented a true break with the imperial past, or its final transformation? Subscribe to After the Sword for more stories about what happens after armies surrender, military orders are abolished, and ruling families lose the worlds built around them.